Hey everyone, welcome to the February 11th replacement lecture for Poli Science 101. We're going to pick up where we left off talking about Abrajano and Haenel's white backlash. So you'll recall that the theories that we were interested in testing, there were two different sets of theories. One is about how people choose their parties, thinking about the Michigan school, where the party is an emotional choice. You make decisions about which party you belong to when you're young, and then that decision becomes part of your identity, similar to a religion or a national heritage part of your identity. And so we're very, very unlikely to switch parties unless something really, really ideologically violent happens either to us or to what the party stands for. And then comparing and contrasting that with Downesian voter choice theories, which argue that people are rational. They look carefully at party platforms and think about which planks of the platform accord with their own moral and policy preferences. And then second, questions about how members of the host society perceive immigration and immigrants themselves. Do we have an anxiety theory that obtains where people view lots of immigrants coming to their neighborhood or to their communities and they become hostile and anxious? Or does the contact theory prevail? People get to know immigrants and they become less scared of them. Abrajano and Haenel, of course, are arguing for a mixture of a Downesian theory and an anxiety theory. They argue that a plurality of white Americans are anxious about immigration, which makes them choose the Republican Party, which has harder line stance on immigrants, which is broadly pushing politics among American whites and therefore American politics in general to be more conservative than it would be otherwise. Okay. So we've gone through and looked at some of the results already, but I want to review these and make sure that we understand not only how to take these results in context, but how they build on one another and how Abrajano and Haenel are admitting that some of their results are inconclusive until you take a look a little bit more deeply. So remember, the first hypothesis, the first thing that we would have expected if Abrajano and Haenel are correct here, is that there should be an association, there should be a correlation between immigration attitudes and partisanship, and they show this, right? We have this figure A here that demonstrates that the warmer a white respondent to certain surveys feels towards immigrants, the more likely they are to be a Democrat, and of course we see the correlation exactly in reverse. The less warm white respondents to these surveys feel, the more likely they are to be Republican. But we mentioned that there were two potential problems with this correlation, right? These two problems are going to come up over and over and over again when we interpret correlations as evidence for a theory, so keep them in mind as we move forward. Those two problems are spurious causation and reverse causation. So spurious causation we spoke about last lecture. There's some third variable that causes both the party identification and the views on immigration. And you could imagine that the most likely third cause would be that some other non immigration issue causes people to choose whether they are Democrat or Republican. So, for example, people are very passionate in their views on being pro life versus pro choice. So, possibly people are choosing their party based upon their views on abortion policy, and then they are allowing policy or feelings toward immigrants to be defined by the party that they've chosen based on abortion. With respect to reverse causation, we just figure that the variable we've suggested as the independent variable is actually the dependent, and the dependent variable is the independent variable. So in this case, party choice changes people's views on immigration rather than the reverse. So you'll notice that the hypothesis that we might derive from this reverse causation, which is consistent with the Michigan school, would be exactly the same as what we observed in the graphs that we've already seen, right? If the Michigan school is correct and people's party identification drives their views on immigration, we should still see a correlation between party identification and immigration views. Okay, so again, to review how we discussed spurious causation, um, like I said, there are reasons to think that this might be true. Most white Americans don't claim that immigration is very important to them, and most white Americans will tell you that they feel sympathetic toward immigrants, even though we saw in previous slides some of the evidence that many white Americans hold racist views toward minorities. But the way that we checked for spurious causation here was this monster regression chart which shows us which sorts of political views and which sorts of demographic characteristics actually associate with being a Republican or a Democrat. And we went through and demonstrated that many of the political views that we think define being Republican or Democrat are actually not well correlated with choosing a party. So whether a person thinks we ought to expand the war on terror, whether they supported the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan, are more or less uncorrelated with whether you choose to be a Republican or a Democrat. Whether you thought that the economy was improving or getting worse under Barack Obama has no correlation with whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. Views on gay rights, views on abortion, these things don't actually correlate very well with Republican or Democratic Party identification. That means that the average white voter has the same view on abortion, the same view on gun rights, the same view on gay rights, the same view on the war on terror, whether they are a Republican or a Democrat, but they don't have the same views on immigration. Their political views on immigration are very predictive of whether they're going to be a Republican or a Democrat. So because the immigration line up here survives, you see those stars show that the relationship is statistically significant. Because that relationship survives controlling for the other relationships, and especially because the other issue areas aren't particularly well related to party choice, it becomes more rational for Abrajano and Haenel to argue that immigration is really the policy preference that's driving choice. Okay. Alternate tests indicate that it doesn't matter which issues they include. They measured outside of the model that we showed here in the slides questions about healthcare, crime, foreign aid, women's rights, the environment, science, universities, all of these things. Regardless of your opinions on economy, the war, abortion, other factors, the view that a person has on undocumented immigrants are very strongly associated with partisan choice. Okay. So, again, we've seen that this immigration attitude has something to do with the race of the people that are perceived of as being immigrants, and so whites are reacting differently to Asian American immigration than they have to Hispanic immigration. But again, we also saw evidence that most Americans believe that sending countries today remain Hispanic countries, even though most immigrants to the United States and most illegal immigrants to the United States are Asian American. Or I guess not Asian American, Asian. Okay, so having reviewed a little bit then about spurious causation, we'll talk now about reverse causation, this possibility that the correlation we've observed between party identification and attitudes towards immigrants, that it's actually the party identification, the party elite of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party tells the party faithful how to feel about immigration, and then as a result, they feel that way, right? Consistent with the Michigan school. So Abrajano and Haenel disagree with this. Relevant quote from the book, along with others, we believe that race and by extension immigration is one of the cases where issue attitudes is consequential. So in general, they argue that the Michigan school may be right with respect to certain issues. We're persuaded and influenced by what the elites of the party that we belong to think about these issues, but they think that race and immigration is not like other issues. They think that this is different. Notice here, this is another important passage from the book. They don't expect you to be convinced yet, right? Assertions and logic aside, we have to stake our case on hard empirical evidence. This is the opening of a section in the book where they discuss the problem of reverse causation and attempt to provide evidence that persuades you that reverse causation is not a problem here. Compare and contrast this with the video clips that we watched from the cable news, right? Where the attempt to hide the problems of reverse causation or spurious causation, to switch hypotheses on the fly when our theory was disproven by the ones that we put out first, is really more of an attempt to hide what might be happening in the data. And I think that when you see frank discussions of the problems of spurious and reverse causation and discussions of precisely which hypotheses and tests are meant to mitigate those problems, that's a sign that you're looking at a book or a set of authors who are interested in getting to the truth rather than increasing their ratings by saying something that they hope that you agree with. Okay, so how might we control for reverse causation? What sorts of behaviors might demonstrate that people choose their party based on attitudes rather than the other way around? Abrajano and Haenel come up with two ways that I think are relatively clever. First, they look for people that change parties. If the Michigan school is true, people that are anti-immigration Democrats should stay Democrats and change their immigration views to fit what the Democratic Party is telling them now. But if Downs is right, they should switch parties. In a different chapter that we didn't read, Aberhano and Haenel run similar tests looking for people that identify with one party but then vote for the opposite party on certain elections or on certain issues, right? But the chapter that we looked at deals explicitly with people that switch parties. So the logic here, of course, is that if we can measure someone's attitude about immigration at time 0, and then check to see what party they belong to at time 1, some period in the future, those people that switch, we should be able to predict based on their attitudes toward immigration better than we can predict their likelihood of switching based on other issues. Here's how Aberhano and Haenel put it. If past views on immigration predict current partisanship, net the effects of past partisanship. We'll talk about what that means in the next slide. That is a suggestion that reverse causation is not a problem. Here is the simplified regression output. Okay, so the first line here shows you that the party that an individual identified with in 2008 is about a 90% predictor of the party that they will identify with in 2009. Okay, so the strongest way that you can guess at a person's party affiliation today is to know their party affiliation in the recent past. This shouldn't be surprising. People don't change their parties very often. But take a look here at the most important factor when people do switch. You can predict 3% of the time what party people belong to based upon their views of immigration, even if you don't know what party they belong to. That is to say that of the 11% roughly of people who switched party identification between the two measurements in this survey, about a quarter of them you could tell whether they were going to switch parties just by looking at their stance on immigration. We can see the anxiety theory and its combination with the Downsian school at play here in the volume of white Americans who belong to each party. Back in 1952, almost all 45% of white Americans identified as Democratic, and only 25% of them identified as being Republican. Today, those proportions are more or less reversed. The Democratic Party only includes 30% of white Americans, whereas the Republican Party at its recent high was closer to 35 or 40%, right? So this has switched potentially partly because of the Republican Southern strategy and the Democratic switch toward being more interested in human civil rights in the 1950s and 60s. But here's a third way to test, right? Let's take a look only at the people who switched parties, right? Or I guess actually that's not true. We're looking at all white Americans again in this graph. So again, the lagged partisanship is the best way to predict whether or not someone is Republican. But you'll see that immigration views, whether they were pro-immigrant white Americans were 22% likely to switch parties in this particular survey, right? So the aggregate attitude on immigration is a significant predictor of future shifts in partisanship. So because of this, we can draw the implication that it's not party that's causing people to choose their views in immigration. In fact, people are observing immigration outcomes. They're choosing their parties based upon their interpretation of immigration policy and immigration policy outcomes. And white Americans are, by and large, becoming more conservative as a result of their anxious reaction towards immigration. Okay. The authors admit here that this test is not perfect, but in conjunction with other tests that are used throughout the book, they become convinced that spurious and reverse causation are not the explanation for the correlation between being Republican and having anti-immigrant views. Given a limited number of years, along with an almost endless array of events, it's not possible to be absolutely positive what causes people's partisanship. But if we start to stack these tests up over time, there aren't very many other explanations that fit the data. So if you find yourself feeling a little offended by this theory, and I suggest you almost should, right? It suggests that your partisanship is somehow only dependent upon your views on immigration, especially if you are white. you do still have to find some explanation for white partisanship in the United States that matches with all of the tests that Abrajano and Haenel have run, and that matches with this generalized sense that attitudes towards immigration are a way to predict party sorting. Okay, so as you review Abrajano and Haenel for midterms and finals, here are a few questions that might help solidify what the reading is about for you. First, you should consider whether the authors presented a compelling case that immigration attitudes drive party identification and not the other way around. Do you think that the sum of all of these tests is persuasive? Do these hypotheses match the theory, and were they measured in a way that satisfy you? Remember, one reason we discussed last week about why they might not satisfy you is that many of the questions on which the authors rely to derive attitudes about migrants ask explicitly about illegal immigration. And if, even though lots and lots of Americans, we've seen other survey data that shows lots and lots of Americans conflate legal and illegal immigration, you might still think that asking people explicitly about illegal immigration is a bad way to collect their views about migration more generally. Second, you might ask how immigration serves as a wedge issue that affects other policy in the United States. This is just a review of the theory, right? Under what circumstances do we expect particular neighborhoods or jurisdictions in the United States to become more conservative? What does it mean that people are choosing their party affiliation based upon their attitude toward immigration with relatively little regard toward the other issue areas that we oftentimes claim make us very passionate? And then lastly, if you were a party strategist, if you wanted to win elections for the Republicans or the Democrats, how might you take this information? How might you read this book and incorporate it into a platform that makes it more likely that the Democrats or the Republicans would win an election? How would you treat immigration as an issue in the United States? How does that match with the way that the Trump campaign treated immigration during 2016? How does it match with the rhetoric about building the wall and the Democratic response today? Okay, so that'll close out our discussion of Abrajano and Haenel. We're going to start now with Edita, Leighton, and Balfour. This is a relatively complicated theory, so I'm going to get through the theory section for today, and then I'll stop the lecture at that point, and you can expect that on Wednesday we'll pick back up understanding what this book is about, but going through the theory again to make sure that we understand the mechanics of it. Okay, so as always, we start off by asking, what is the puzzle that the authors of this book hope to explore here? I think that you can break down Edita, Leighton, and Balfour, which I'll probably just refer to as Edita from now on, into about 4 questions that are closely related. The first question: can Muslims integrate into Western societies? Does the influx of Muslim immigrants, particularly to Western Europe, bode ill for some sort of Christian heritage society that exists there today? Second, are rooted citizens in Christian heritage societies Islamophobic? There's some reason to suggest that they are, right? Survey-based evidence here confirms that Muslims are widely perceived as a menace by Christian heritage societies. 43% of people in France who were interviewed in 2012 responded by saying that Muslim communities were a menace to the identity of France, and that compares with 51% in Germany. Right? So a lot of Europeans believe that this is a problem. Third, is discrimination against Muslims in Europe rational? Now we're going to get down to discussing what rationality means to Edita and her co-authors later, but remember from the very first class that by rational we don't mean justified. Right? We're not talking about a morally justified type of rationality. What we mean is that the discrimination that Muslims face in Europe from their Christian counterparts is related to a material purpose. That Christians who are engaging in discrimination against Muslims are doing so in order to meet some goal that they have articulated for themselves. And the last question that I think the book covers: how do Muslims react to discriminatory behavior? The authors are worried that Muslim reactions to discrimination lead to an equilibrium of mutual hostility. If they are discriminated against strongly enough, there's no point for Muslims in assimilating because they won't be treated as though they have assimilated, even if they go through all of the work. Right? These are important questions, Adita Leighton and Balfour argue, because Muslims are expected to constitute a growing share of the population of Christian heritage societies because they continue to migrate and they have higher than average fertility rates for Western Europe. Um, it's also true that in the last few years there have been an increasing number of racist acts that have been directed at religious minorities, both Jewish and Muslim, in Western Europe and in the United States. And so understanding the dynamic by which Muslim immigrants assimilate and think about assimilation and the way in which the Christian heritage host society in which they find themselves reacts to those assimilation behaviors becomes increasingly important. Okay, so lit review. There's not really a lit review here, but we engage instead in a comparison of two legitimate ways that you might model immigration and assimilation. The first is what they refer to as an assimilationist approach, right? The assimilationist approach argues that new immigrants have a duty to fit in wherever they go. The fastest way that you can develop friendly relations between a migrant group and the host society is for the migrant group to assimilate in some understandable ways. They learn the language, they don't allow the political expressions of their religion to interfere with the trajectory of politics in the country. Maybe they even adopt some of the standards for food and decoration and these sorts of things where they go in order to ameliorate or mitigate the anxiety concerns that we discussed in Abrahano and Haenel. Right, so here are some examples of assimilationist approaches. Integration is best achieved through compulsory assimilation policies. From this perspective, immigrants need to be compelled to adhere to a common set of values or norms, right? So we pick some set of values or norms that we think exists at the center of the host society, and we demand that immigrants adhere to those values. The second large school of thought about immigrants and immigrant assimilation are referred to as multicultural approaches. These approaches argue that society functions best when cultural traditions can express themselves tolerantly and together. So the only real important assimilationist behavior, according to the multicultural approaches, is that the new immigrants and the host communities are each tolerant of each other's expressions. There's probably room in multicultural approaches to argue that new immigrant groups need to learn the language of and obey the laws of their new host society, but in terms of their cultural and religious expression, it's sort of a school of allowing 1,000 flowers to bloom, right? These theories reject the notion that cultural incompatibility exists, and they argue that cultural pluralism is actually good for society. It drives growth, it creates variety in the restaurants we can go to, the types of music that we can experience, all of these types of things. And successful integration of immigrants is best realized when governments celebrate cultural diversity. That's the fastest way to get to relationships that are sort of mutually affirming. Okay, so the first thing that we start off with then in the chapters that we were assigned from Adita is a demonstration that anti-Muslim discrimination exists. And this discrimination comes, or this evidence, comes mostly from a variety of CV experiments, what are known as CV experiments, right? CV experiments introduce identical resumes with different names. So in these CV experiments, typically what happens, you send out resumes that have identical experience, identical schooling, they're word for word the same, except you change the name of your candidate to reflect some sort of underlying ethnicity or nationality or religion that you think might experience discrimination, and then ask whether the job applications that accompany these CVs get different responses. Okay, so here's an example, right? Duget et al. Computed that for every 100 positive responses a fictional native French candidate received, fictional Muslim North African candidates received only 25. So again, identical CVs, the candidates should be qualified on paper in identical ways, but those with North African Muslim names received about 25% the number of callbacks as people with French names. Okay, there's a problem here though, right? The problem with these surveys is that typically they use names that come from North Africa, which suggests that the problem, the discrimination that we're seeing might arise either from religion, because the HR department sees the person as being a Muslim rather than a Christian, or due to national origin. Maybe they're discriminating against people from North Africa rather than people who are Muslim. So, why is this important, right? A different source of bias probably implies different problems or different prejudices. So, if we want to attack discrimination using public policy, we probably want to know who's actually being discriminated against. And so, Adida, Leighton, and Balfour argue that the literature on anti-Muslim discrimination in France is biased by the fact that we can't tell whether these CVs are being rejected on the basis of religion or national origin, right? Here's an example, again, from a real study. The name Yassine Moukraoui sends the recruiter two pieces of information. It tells the recruiter the applicant's region of origin as North Africa and the applicant's religious tradition as Muslim. Therefore, it's difficult to know whether the callback rates between Yassine and Clement are different because there's a difference in national origin or a difference in religion. There's a second problem, though, as well. It's possible that this reflects rational or irrational discrimination. So let's talk just a minute about the difference here between rational or irrational discrimination. And this is a thing that we'll go over again in class on Wednesday, but I'd just like to discuss it briefly before we move on here. By rational discrimination, what Adida, Leighton, and Balfour mean is that Muslims, on average, have some characteristic that's less favorable to hiring, on average, than their Christian counterparts who were born and raised in France, right? So, for example, maybe it is rational to believe that Muslims with North African names are less likely to be fully fluent or fully literate in French if they grew up speaking Arabic or they grew up speaking another language and French is their second language, but of course they don't list that on their resume. Maybe the discrimination occurs because the HR department can't tell the difference between these two resumes, and so they decide between them on the basis of believing that the Muslim is less likely to speak French well. Now, it may be immoral to judge an individual job candidate's fluency based upon a person's preconceived notions of the average fluency of the group. But it is still rational to do so, right? If it's true that the underlying literacy between Arabic-speaking Muslims and French-speaking Christians in French is likely to be different, then it's still rational to kick out Muslim applicants on the grounds that they are more likely to be less literate than their Christian counterparts who are equally well qualified, right? So then what does irrational discrimination mean? It just means that you hate Muslims, right? You just don't want to be around someone who practices a different faith than you, and you think that that person is likely to end up having some sort of trouble in your organization simply because there are prejudices that exist, right? So it has nothing to do with qualifications. I just have a personal distaste toward a particular religion or a particular race. So again, it's important to understand whether the discrimination is rational or irrational because those types of discrimination imply different policy output that might fix them, right? If the discrimination is rational, then you might be able to better integrate Muslims into your society by providing a certain amount of French language instruction that would make sure that Muslims were on average as literate in French as rooted French Christians were, right? Whereas if we're dealing with an irrational hatred, you need some sort of public policy that confronts or punishes or highlights the fact that this discrimination is irrational and immoral. Okay, so here's again Adida, Leighton, and Balfour on this issue. Assume that a recruiter correctly believes that an unobserved characteristic, those absent from a resume, such as willingness to work in teams, are lower on average among Muslims than Christians. This leads the recruiter to rationally favor Christian applicants, even if the Muslim and Christian applicants have the exact same resumes, right? Anti-Muslim discrimination can also be based in prejudice. We just don't want to be around Muslims. That's irrational. It's not going to hurt your company to hire them. You just don't like it. Okay, so hopefully this is clear. Again, we'll take some time to review it on Wednesday. Okay, so these are crucial methodological challenges, right? Adida, Leighton, and Balfour claim not only that they can pin down whether it's religion or national origin that matters for discrimination. They also claim that they can pin down the extent to which the discrimination that Muslims face in Europe is rational or irrational. And then they're going to go on to claim, in fact, that they can measure the extent to which Muslims are reacting to rational or irrational discrimination by failing to assimilate. So that's where we're going to call it for today. Take a little bit of time with the reading. Think about how it is that Adida, Leighton, and Balfour propose to untangle these two very difficult measurement problems. And then when we come back on Wednesday, we'll discuss exactly how convinced you are by the way that they managed it. All right, see you guys then.